In this segment, we're going to start talking about the Islamic Revolution in Iran and Iran after the revolution. And the way I want to cover this is to talk about the phases of the revolution. Before doing so, I want to go back to the very last slide we had in the previous segment, in which I tried to depict two trends that intersected. One trend was the trend toward mass politics or increased political participation. The other trend really was the rise of secularism, which in the graph I depicted as a decline in religiosity. And the interesting thing about the two graphs were, at least that was the point I was trying to communicate, was that the growth in political participation was increasing at a geometric rate, whereas the growth in secularism, or if you like, decline in religiosity, was increasing at an arithmetic rate. And that, in a sense, was the basis for explaining why the revolution, as it occurred at the time that it occurred in Iran, ended up having an Islamic character with Islamic charismatic leader. So with the success of the revolution, the revolutionary is now in power, and Iran begins its phase of Republican phase, I should say. And remember now, Iran has been a monarchy for well over 2,500, and suddenly that revolution changes everything. The best way I can, and in an efficient way, hopefully, to cover this topic is to break down the revolution in various phases. So I want to begin with the first phase. The first phase I would depict as February 1979, when the revolution actually consummated, to November of 1979, about 9 months. This period is marked by the premiership of Bazargan. He is the prime minister. He has a lay cabinet. In a sense, what that means is that his entire cabinet is made out of lay individuals. There are no clerics with any official position in this cabinet. And therefore, those who at first witnessed the rise of Islamic post-revolutionary government, they noticed that it was dominated by lay, with clerics really in the background. In fact, even Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution, as he had promised when he was in exile in Paris, he said he doesn't want to have anything to do with the government. He's just going to go to the holy city of Rome, and stay at Rome. And so he actually satisfied his promise by leaving. But at the same time, it was clear to everyone that the real power, the gravitas, really laid with Ayatollah Khomeini. He was the undisputed charismatic leader, and when things weren't getting done in the capital, people would travel the 90 miles distance to Rome to get his input. So even though the government is a lay government without any clerics, nonetheless, increasingly people try to get Ayatollah Khomeini involved, so that Ayatollah Khomeini here and there are making pronouncement that affects the conduct of governance under Bazargan. And in fact, in one or two speeches, Bazargan literally complains that, saying that if I have to run this, then we can't have the leader constantly changing and making policies for us. So this government is pretty unsteady in many ways because of the environment that existed at the time. There are various factions that are very dissatisfied with Bazargan because they see him as essentially a non-revolutionary, moderate individual. At the same time, he's trying to maintain a government in a very, very inhospitable political environment So his tenure really comes to an end in the next phase, and the next phase begins in November of 1979, really November 4th of 1979, but lasts quite a while afterwards. The second phase was triggered by a very important event in the relationship between the United States and Iran, and that was the taking of the attack on the American embassy and taking of the American diplomats as hostages. That effectively ended the relationship between Iran and the United States, and you've got to remember that in many ways the Iranian Revolution was not just to overthrow the Shah of Iran, but also to sever relationship with the United States in the minds of a lot of the revolutionaries. That is, to put an end to United States interference. So the revolution was at once anti-monarchical and anti-American in its character. Later on, when we compare the Iranian Revolution with the Egyptian Revolution, you will notice that the distinct anti-American component was really absent in the case of the Egyptian Revolution, whereas it was at the heart of Iranian Revolution, because the Shah of Iran was seen as America's Shah rather than the Iranian Shah. So the hostage crisis is the triggering event, and essentially that leads to the fall of Bazargan's government, because he's opposed to taking of the American hostages, and so his government resigns, basically. Phase 2 is also very important for domestic reasons, and that is, in many ways, Phase 2 has been dubbed the Second Revolution. The Second Revolution in the following sense: if you compare it to the October 17 Bolshevik takeover of the government after the February Revolution in Russia, one can make a similar case for Iran, that the Second Revolution, with the taking of the American hostages, led to the clerics being able to take over the reins of government. Now, the period embraces a 10-year Iran-Iraq war that's going to start in September of 1980. That war, in many ways, was what helped the regime to survive, as odd as it seemed. And the invasion of Iran by Saddam Hussein created a war that was very much in the tradition of the long trench war of World War I. And what it did was to at least temporarily suspend public's expectations of economic growth and economic prosperity, because Iranian nations began to recognize that they're stuck with a war economy. And the fact that this was an attack by Saddam Hussein on Iran, pretty much unprovoked, although there are some debates about how much of it was provoked, but certainly the provocation really did not justify the kind of aggression that Saddam embarked on. The war then ended up granting regime quite a bit of breathing space and gave it a lot more decisional latitude to be able to turn back the Iraqi invaders who had occupied a large swath of Iran, and to be able to liberate the area. So Phase 2 was dubbed the Second Revolution, and as I mentioned, the Iran-Iraq war was a critical part of it. Phase 2 comes to an end with the passing of Ayatollah Khomeini a year after Iran-Iraq war was officially ended. The war ended in 1988 under a very, very strong push by the United Nations mediation, and the signing of the ceasefire or ending of the war was a real blow to Ayatollah Khomeini. In fact, he likened it to drinking from a poisoned chalice. So after the war, Ayatollah Khomeini is very frail, and in about a year from the ending of the war, he passes away. And his passing led to the next phase. Now, I should also point out at this juncture that this decade was a very, very important decade for the Islamic component of the Republic to be able to dominate the government and change, in essence, the direction of the revolution. And so it permitted the clerics to be able to consolidate power, and in so doing, they were able to implement the very institutional foundations of an Islamic theocracy. And so that is why Phase 2 has been dubbed the Second Revolution. It was the Second Revolution that really inaugurated the domination of the clerics in the government. As we go to the third phase is the beginning of the post-Khomeini era, and it begins with the presidency of Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of the lieutenants of Ayatollah Khomeini. And it also coincides, as I mentioned, with the passing away of the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. Many scholars, when they look at Rafsanjani's presidency, tend to view that as a period that is called a thermidor. Thermidor is a word that was applied to the French Revolution and is now applied to the Iranian Revolution. It essentially marks a retreat from the radical goals, from the extremism that characterizes the early phase of the revolution, or in the case of Iran, the second revolution, into or morphing into a more pragmatic phase, into a phase that would emphasize reconstruction, into a phase that would focus on recovery. And remember, Iran was just coming out of war with Iraq, and so naturally the expectation was there that recovery is going to take place. Now, this phase is interesting because the charismatic leader is now gone, and there are no leaders on the scene, religious or secular, who have anywhere close to the charisma and appeal of Ayatollah Khomeini. Therefore, these people know, the people that are ruling Iran know that they have to consolidate power using whatever they have been able to institutionalize during that 10-year Phase 2 period. So in this phase, Rafsanjani, together with Ayatollah Khamenei, who is now the new leader after passing away of Ayatollah Khomeini, they begin to create what is called a dual leadership. So how do they do that? They do this by amending the Constitution in 1989, and as a part of the amendment, on the one hand, they actually end up strengthening the position of the president by eliminating that of the prime minister. So now Iran no longer has a prime minister and has a more powerful president. But at the same time, they also weaken both the office of presidency, the executive branch, and the legislative branch vis-a-vis the position of the leader. In other words, the dual leadership on the one hand strengthened the presidency from what it originally was, because it gave the power of prime minister to the president. But at the same time, both the presidency and of course the legislative branch, both of them were weakened by making the leadership even stronger than it was. In addition, they further amended the Constitution in that now amendment as well required the leader's approval. Finally, they created one more institution, and this is called the Expediency Council, or Maslahat in Farsi. Later on, when we talk about the structure of the Iranian government, I will point that out as to where it's located and what its powers are. But the Expediency Council was an important change because it gave it a very, very powerful role, and that was the role of mediating between the parliament, if there is a conflict between the parliament and another religious organ called the Guardian Council. The change, to get an idea of enormity of the changes that was introduced, went well beyond what Ayatollah Khomeini originally had in mind, and according to him, quote, "This organ should not become a power alongside the other three powers." Well, what they did was to make it exactly that. In fact, it's not just alongside of other three powers, that is the three branches, it actually is above those three branches in many ways. Anyway, going back to the Rafsanjani era, the pent-up public expectations for economic growth, for economic recovery and welfare now began to manifest itself because the war was over, and now people were expecting that jobs and their salaries, everything else is going to improve. In reality, President Rafsanjani disappointed them. Economic reconstruction and liberalization that was expected and in some cases promised really were not properly implemented, and the economy really didn't improve that much. In this period also, another very important and in some ways ominous development began to take shape, and that was the growth of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps also took place. They're also known as the Pastaran, the guardians of the Guardian Revolution. This was a force that was created at the very beginning of the revolution because the clerics did not trust the Shah's army and armed forces. They were worried about the possible coup d'etat. Therefore, very, very quickly they created a paramilitary force called the Guardians of the Revolution, and it morphed into Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And their job was to protect the Islamic Republic, especially against the domestic armed forces in case of coup d'etat. Later on, they were very active during the Iran-Iraq war, and so by the end of the war, they're the major force and they're the elite force in Iran. What happened during the presidency of Rafsanjani was that the Pastaran really began to penetrate the economy of Iran, and their tentacles began to enter into construction, transportation, oil and gas sector of Iranian economy. So in essence, they created a lot of economic interest in the country at the expense of the private enterprise and the private sector. And this, you will see in many ways, is very similar to what happened in Egypt under Mubarak. The military there too was also very much involved in the domestic economy, monopolizing various industries and economic sectors. So by the end of Rafsanjani's period, what you have is a very dissatisfied situation in Iran, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has become a major economic institution. Finally, to add fuel to the dissatisfaction of the disappointment with economic recovery, what you have is a rampant corruption throughout the government, so that further adds and fuel to dissatisfaction on the part of the population. So at the end of phase 3, we have an interesting development. If you remember, the dual leadership started out with increasing the power for both the president and the leader. At the end of the phase 3, the dual leadership power sharing formula had morphed into a clear, undisputed domination by the leader. So the dual leadership at the end of the period is really gone. You have a single leader, all powerful, and that's the Ayatollah Khamenei.